So where is human evolution taking us? Some people argue that humans will or have already stopped evolving. This is likely a result of the argument that we change the environment around us. Modern medicine, industrial agriculture, all of this has allowed us to survive and possibly not be subject to natural selection anymore. However, changes in our DNA, sexual selection, and other forms of evolution continue to make an impact. There is evidence that genes are still evolving within the Homo sapiens species, and that these genes have changed in the last 5 to 15,000 years. These changes include changes in genes involved in senses, such as the sense of taste or smell, likely a result of our omnivorous lifestyle, allowing us to distinguish between good food and bad or toxic food. Changes in our ability to digest food have also resulted in the last 5 to 15,000 years. This is most evident in our ability to digest lactose. Humans, like all mammals, consume dairy and milk in infancy. However, nearly all mammals have a mechanism whereby they no longer have the ability to digest lactose once they go through puberty. This is because most mammals don't consume dairy products or breast milk after childhood. However, there is a huge portion of the human population that can actually continue to digest lactose, the sugar found in dairy products, through adulthood. This is not consistent universally, though. There are some populations of Homo sapiens that can digest milk quite readily, whereas other populations, it's pretty rare. And lactose intolerance is actually more the norm. You can see this in this picture here, where the darkly shaded regions contain populations of people that can digest lactose, whereas the lighter shaded regions are more typical of mammalian populations, where the ability to digest lactose or dairy is reduced into adulthood. The ability to digest lactose correlates quite well with the human history in that region of domestication of sheep, goats, and cows. The populations of people that have been able to domesticate those animals early were able to then consume the milk, and those that were able to tolerate the milk consumption into adulthood had an advantage over those that did not. They had a very rich nutrient source. Consuming cow, sheep, or goat milk, allowing them to consume high fat, high sugar, high nutrient foods, like the cow, sheep, or goat milk, whereas others who were not able to digest the dairy into adulthood could not have access to this nutrient source, and thus were less likely to generate offspring and continue their lineage. Other features of humans have continued to evolve as well. This includes an evolution of bone structure that we've seen in humans, as humans evolved and changed their lifestyles from a hunter and gatherer society to an agricultural society. Planting crops, it turns out, requires a different bone structure and skeletal structure than hunting and gathering does. With our transition away from agricultural lifestyles, this change in bone structure may continue. I'm sure you're also aware of the fact that humans have altered their skin color, as we briefly talked about with Neanderthals, but this continued with lots of Homo sapiens species. Skin color is directly correlated with the amount of sun exposure humans are subjected to. The more sun, the more vitamin D is accessible to that individual. However, the increased risk in skin cancer. So melanin is found more commonly in individuals with high sun exposure. They don't need to absorb the sunlight because they're constantly exposed to high amounts of solar radiation. However, they do need to protect themselves from the UV radiation from the sun, allowing them to protect themselves from skin cancer. In northern latitudes, this is different in that individuals need to have increased sun exposure, especially during the winter months when sun exposure is a lot more reduced. This allows them to retain the vitamin D nutrients that their body can make in the sun, while not having to worry so much about protecting themselves against solar radiation and skin cancer. Homo sapiens have also continued to evolve as a species, where we've seen an increase in brain function and brain size upon birth. This larger cranium, larger skull, and larger brain at birth was an advantage for many generations of Homo sapiens, allowing their children to have increased brain capacity through childhood and into adulthood. However, having a larger brain and larger skull at birth also meant very painful birthing process and an increased risk in the mortality of the mother and the child. Finally, we've seen an evolution in humans as a result of disease resistance. One of the most notable of these is in sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a genetic disease that affects hemoglobin, a molecule found in red blood cells. This molecule, when affected by the sickle cell mutation, causes red blood cells to have a sickle cell shape, or a sort of crescent moon shape, as opposed to the biconcave, more spherical shape of a normal typical red blood cell. The sickle cell shape causes individuals with this genetic disease to have an increased risk of mortality or death if those sickle cells end up getting trapped in the blood vessels. This could lead to an increased risk of heart attack or stroke. The normal red blood cells move much easier through the capillaries and blood vessels of the body. However, it also turns out that the sickle cell shape of the red blood cells inhibits or prevents malaria, a parasite, from entering the red blood cells and causing an infection. That is why in regions where there is high malaria incidence and the risk of contracting and dying from malaria is really high, mirrors the areas of the world where you have high rates of the sickle cell genetic disease. It turns out that if we take a look at this informative chart down here at the bottom, if you have sickle cell genetic disease in areas where there's no malaria, you have an increased risk of mortality. But in areas with malaria, it protects you from malaria, meaning you are less susceptible to dying and death than not having sickle cell at all. Individuals that don't have sickle cell and are typically normal are much more susceptible to malarial infections and much more readily die from malaria. Here in the United States, having sickle cell genetic disease is disadvantageous because we don't have malaria. It doesn't protect us from anything, and the increased risk in heart attack or stroke is more detrimental. However, in areas with malaria, where you're very likely to contract malaria multiple times in your life, having the sickle cell trait or sickle cell disease means that you're protected from this deadly disease, and it's actually advantageous. Looking into the future, which traits are going to be affected most by human evolution, scientists have concluded that disease will still make a major impact in our evolutionary changes, even with the advent of modern medicine. In addition to that, sexual selection will also continue to play a role. Sexual selection is when one gender chooses traits or characteristics they prefer in the other sex. For instance, a lack of body hair, especially in men and women of the Homo sapien species, is thought to be a result of sexual selection, in that men and women prefer to see less body hair on their sexual partners. This type of sexual selection is thought to continue into the future as different sexes choosing their sexual partners will continue. That's all we've got for evolution of human species. I hope you learned a lot and enjoyed this lecture.